Welcome back to r/NeighborsFromHell, where people share stories about their crazy neighbors, and if you're new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe to join our amazing community, and without any further ado, let's dive right into the stories. The first story is titled, "Neighboring apartment tenants decided to creep into my paid parking spot and then complained to landlords that I was too close to their vehicle and was dinging their massive truck." My parking spot is on the right side of the power box and theirs is on the left. For a while, especially while I was gone during the evening for work, they have slowly moved more and more to the right until they were literally almost touching my car, keeping me from opening my driver's side door. Since I had to enter my car from the passenger side and this has only been the case for 2 days, I decided not to immediately say anything to them or my landlords, thinking they were just not paying attention. My side of the parking lot also has an extra space that is unused and unpowered that my brother would park in when he visited, or any visitors could use as long as they didn't block my car or could fit between me and the light post. So a small compact can go there, but not a huge heavy duty truck. For 3 years there hasn't been an issue with anyone parking there, and my female landlord even told me it was a perk for my apartment in the summer since I require a renovation and the snow removal guy tends to harass me every winter because he is too lazy to dump the snow where he is supposed to do it, and it blocks me from parking properly in my paid powered parking space. And by the way guys, if you know what a powered parking space is, then please enlighten me. Anyway, new neighbors moved in a year ago. Their friends would try to park in my parking space or box me in with their big Dodge heavy duties. My car is a small Ford hatchback. I never complained, but my other neighbors have complained on my behalf. As they could see, I was being squeezed out and boxed in by people that parked like they were drunk, plus the offending neighbors' friends would park in other units' parking spaces without permission. On top of this, they had attempted to use other units' power during the winter and began complaining when people started turning off their breakers for their spaces when they left the apartments. So I guess guys that powered spaces means essentially a heated parking spot or something? I'm still not completely sure. Anyway, I had been patient and honestly believed they would eventually get the clue that they only had one parking space, as they also drive big Dodges and they should ask before just parking wherever. Also, as it is summer, I could move over into the unpowered spot if they really needed to fit their 2 vehicles there until winter hit. However, I got the lovely text from my male landlord that these neighbors are complaining that I'm the one parking too close and that I had dinged their truck. He expressed that we only get 1 parking space and mentioned my brother's car, who was currently parked beside me in the unofficial visitor spot, and on the other side of him, my lovely neighbors had parked their truck on the street. Meaning my brother parked before they got a chance to attempt to get their truck to fit there and were probably kicked out of my Irish neighbor's space because his girlfriend owns a vehicle and has been staying the past week. So I texted back that they were trying to park in my space and that if they are so upset about how close I was, I would be calling a tow truck to remove their vehicle at their expense. I also explained where they have been parking, how they have been parking, and what they and their buddies have been attempting to do. My landlord texted back that he was not trying to start a text war, meaning he probably texted them to ask if I was telling the truth, and I threatened to take pictures if he really needed proof. So he just asked me to have my brother, who visits once a week to every 2 weeks, move onto the street out front, and that no one is allowed to park in the unpowered spot until we have proper signage put up next month clearly defining who owns what space, even though it is already labeled on the power boxes. I have never had an incident living there for the past 3 years. My apartment needs repairs, but I've been patient with my male landlord who handles maintenance, and I get along with my other neighbors just fine. No one has ever complained about my brother or anyone parking in the empty space besides me. I only ever told off the snow removal guy because I'd been working night shifts and they need me to move at a time I was sleeping. However, these kids move in with their loud heavy-duty monster trucks, not thinking that they either have to get smaller vehicles or pay for an extra powered space. try to bully my elderly neighbor, and try to steal power from other units. And then when they get all worried, a tiny hatchback is parking too close that they might get dinged because they are trying to fit 2 trucks in a single space. Apparently it is my problem to solve for them. Well, the following was my solution. I had their trucks towed and impounded at a nice big parking space located in the local junkyard 2 miles out of town at their expense. I am fine with no one being allowed to park on my right, doesn't mean it will solve those dingbats parking issues. I am exactly where I am supposed to be, and that's that. And guys, if you enjoy the stories about crazy neighbors as much as I do, then I would really appreciate it if you could post some star emojis in the comments and maybe even give the video a like if you really enjoy it. Thank you so much in advance for your amazing support. And the next one is a little bonus revenge story which is titled Escalating Feud Leads to Dad Orchestrating His Brother's Arrest. My uncle has always been a self-righteous, petty slimeball with a foul temper and grandiose idea of his own importance, but little to no brains. My dad always just took it and tried to keep the peace because the family is so important to him. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. It is pretty long since it covers several months of a feud between them. As a background, my dad and my uncle are neighbors in a rural community of 600-ish people. My dad built the house my uncle lives in and sold it along with a small plot of land, so my dad's remaining land is about 6 acres. And runs along the side and the back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle is a dealer for HVAC units. My dad is in the HVAC business and would buy some things from his brother, even though his brother's prices were higher and he had a more limited inventory than other dealers in order to help his brother out. My dad also rented a building his brother owned and used it as his shop/office. He only rented the building and parking lot, but in the field out behind the shop, my uncle and my dad would both collect old HVAC units. These things are rusty and all around fugly, but when they didn't have anything else to do, they could get one of these old units to break down for scrap. This story starts when one day my dad went to his brother and said he needed a certain unit, but his brother quoted him a really high price and also couldn't deliver in the time frame my dad needed. So my dad called up another dealer he works with, and that guy had a unit on hand to give him for a much lower price, which was a no-brainer. My uncle found out about this somehow. Dudes in the HVAC business are apparently like gossipy teenage girls, and confronted my dad, basically giving him an ultimatum that if my dad wouldn't commit to buying 100% of his units from my uncle, then my uncle wouldn't sell him anything. I already told you, my uncle is an idiot. So my dad did not say anything to his brother, but he took him at his word and stopped buying anything from him. A month or so later, my uncle showed up at my dad's shop and confronted him again, wanting to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything from him that month. When my dad told him why, my uncle exploded. They apparently had a screaming match, and in the end my uncle announced that my dad was no longer his brother, they were no longer doing business together, and my dad was evicted from the shop. I will note that legally my dad was not evicted because evicting him would have required a legal notice, a certain period of time, etc., but my dad was over it, so he said fine and began converting the barn at his house into his new shop. So my uncle, who apparently had thought my dad would not call his bluff, showed back up at the shop a few days later and informed my dad that he also has to move all of the old HVAC units scattered around in the field behind the property, or he would sue my dad for the cost of removal. Now, this too probably had no legal power, since my dad's lease was only on the building, not the field, and my uncle contributed to and used the old units as communal property. But when my dad is pissed off, he is really pissed off. So he agreed to move the old units, he took his tractor over and loaded each one onto his flatbed trailer, drove out behind his barn and painstakingly arranged hundreds of rust bucket fugly old HVAC units an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. Note that my dad could not see these things from his house due to the way his property is set up, but my uncle had an HD view of them in his backyard. My uncle started being even more of a creep than usual and was always spying on my dad's house, so my dad decided to build a privacy fence down the side of his property that runs along my uncle's property, but not the back of the property where the HVAC units are. The fence guys arrived and worked for a few hours before my uncle came screeching into his driveway and exploded out of his truck, already screaming because these poor fence guys had laid posts or tools or whatever temporarily on his side of the property line as they were building the fence. My uncle called the police, who basically told the fence guys, "Okay dudes, just don't put anything on this crazy man's property," and then left. The next day, apparently someone left a hammer across the property line, so here comes my uncle screaming at them again. He called the police again, but by the time they got there, the guy had already moved his hammer, so the police were just annoyed by this point, but could only warn them not to do it again. Later that afternoon, my uncle called the police a third time. I kid you not, this time he wanted to report that my dad had stolen a backhoe from him, like one that attaches to the back of a tractor. One that, again I kid you not, my uncle had given to my dad 2 whole years prior, because my uncle did not even have a tractor big enough to attach the thing to. The cop was not amused when this story came to light, and since it was the same cop who had been there earlier that day, she was beyond annoyed at that point. My dad helpfully said, "Come get the backhoe if you want it," knowing full well my uncle had no way to pick the thing up or haul it even the few feet to his own yard. My uncle replied that my dad was just trying to trap him and would say he was trespassing if my uncle came onto his land, even though the cop was standing right there when my dad offered, and by the way, this conversation was taking place in my dad's driveway. He then said that he wanted to file a complaint with the police that basically amounts to a restraining order against my dad. It is not a restraining order because it is not issued by a judge, but the cops treat it that way. It is for habitual trespassers. Annoyed cop helpfully informed my dad that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him and invited him to come over to his house to discuss things, even if my dad had that written proof he had been invited, if my uncle called the cops or even took a picture of my dad on his property, he could potentially get arrested for trespassing. My dad said he wanted to file one against his brother too. The pro-revenge part of the story is now upon us. My dad knew full well that his brother had no real clue where the property lines were and was not going to dig up his survey to check. He only knew where the lines were because my dad knows exactly where they are and maintains wooden stops in the ground periodically along his property lines. So when his brother was away for a few days, my dad moved all of the old HVAC units along the property line over further onto his own property by a few feet and moved the stops back the same distance. So basically it looked the same as it had before, except it looked like the property line was a few feet further back than it actually is. He then placed some random pieces of scrap across the fake property line, which was, yes, still on his own property, but it looked like it was across the property line if all you had to go by were the incorrectly placed stops. Set up a few cameras aimed at the line and then waited. Sure enough, his dumbass brother came storming out of his house as soon as he noticed this scrap on his side of the property line. He crossed the real property line to get a good look at the scrap and called the police. My dad was waiting for them with his survey showing where the actual property line is, a copy of the report annoyed cop had given him, and game camera footage of his brother clearly trespassing on his land, and it was then my uncle who got arrested. The only way his revenge for all the trouble and heartache his brother caused could possibly have been any sweeter would have been if it were an annoyed cop who showed up at the scene and arrested my uncle, but alas he had to make do with someone he and his brother had both gone to high school with. Which worked out since it was especially embarrassing for my uncle to be arrested by someone he knew well, and who could make sure everyone else in town knew. Edited to add, nothing really came of my uncle's arrest, or at least not that my dad has heard about. And yes, he would hear about it since this is a town of like 600-ish people, but it was probably enough for my uncle just to have to get put into handcuffs, spend a night in jail, and have people know about it because my uncle has not caused any more trouble for my dad other than generally existing, where my dad occasionally has to see his truck drive by. My uncle is also now in a business dispute with his wife's sister and his brother-in-law, so presumably he is trying to take his anger out on another target who has not already beaten him, and also who isn't his older and much larger brother who has been perfectly willing to beat his ass all their lives whenever it's devolved into physical disputes. And yes, my family are rednecks. My uncle, aunt, cousin and my cousin's wife all unfriended me on social media, so I only know what's going on with them via small town gossip nowadays. My sister was driving down the road recently, saw my uncle in his yard and waved at him. He turned away like he didn't know her. None of us got an announcement when my cousin's wife had her baby recently, so I think the end of the story is just that we are all dead to my uncle and his family, but he is too afraid to do anything besides pretend we all don't exist. And the next one is titled, Dad helps my friend and me get back at middle school bully, aka why you should never anger a dad who happens to be an engineer. This week was our middle school reunion. Most of us went to the same K-8 schools, ages 6 to 14, for our friends across the pond, and while we all were laughing and talking over Zoom, my friend, whom I will call Janice, brought up this memory. At our schools, with the exception of kindergarten, 2 grades would be paired together, so 1st and 2nd grades would be taught together, 3rd and 4th would be taught together, so on and so forth. The 7th and 8th grades had to do a special project every year called Toy Team or TT. Basically, we would be put into teams, build a specific toy that we could market. Representatives from local businesses would be invited to judge our projects and win awards in various categories: best presentation, best design, best research, etc. The idea behind this project was to teach teamwork, ingenuity, creativity, etc., but in the end it caused more trouble than it was worth, for reasons I will get to in a moment. I hated TT with a passion, the biggest reason being that the boys would take over the building of the toy and the girls did the secretarial work, listing results, surveying the groups, writing final reports, etc. It was not fair, but I was always too afraid to speak my mind and ask to help building, something I've always enjoyed. But 8th grade year was the one that almost broke me because of one kid. Enter Carlos, not his real name. Carlos was in 7th grade but was touted as a math and science genius. He had to go to the local high school to take math/science classes because none of the teachers at our school were qualified to teach at his level. He also prided himself on being a cool kid and had a gang of sycophants follow him around, reaffirming his greatness. In reality, Carlos was a little punk who honestly should have used a lesson or two in the school of hard knocks. He was a jerk to the highest degree, always looked down on everyone else, and since his parents, who were honestly Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy come to life, defended his actions and threatened everyone around them. Because it was a private school and Carlos' parents were big donors, even the teachers were limited in what they could and could not do to discipline him. The worst they could do was detention, but he just shrugged it off. Seriously, unless he killed somebody, Carlos was untouchable. Janice and I were thrilled to be in the same group until we learned we would be paired with Carlos. Carlos immediately took over the project and bossed Janice and me around. Janice and I were favorite targets for Carlos and his sycophants because we were quiet, kept to ourselves and just focused on our work. Carlos proceeded to make our experience in TT miserable. He claimed that because he was the big math and science expert, only he could build our glider and we had to write it down. Janice and I put up with it at first because we knew our teachers would do nothing and it was just an 8-week-long group project. And then one day, during week 6, it happened. We had to test the gliders. Our testing rigs was set up with yardsticks and rubber bands on tables. You would load the gliders into the rubber bands, pull them back and launch. Then you would measure how far they flew and make your corrections. Once again, the boys took over and the girls did the recording. Janice and I were making notes when I noticed the rubber band was about to snap due to how stretched out it was. I warned Carlos about the rubber band and to adjust the glider. When he protested, our teacher, who I will call Mrs. Adams, snapped at him and told him, "Listen to your partners and adjust." Well, Carlos did as said, but he pulled back the glider back too far and too fast. As a result, the rubber band snapped. The rubber band not only slapped Carlos in the face, but broke our glider to pieces because he pulled it back too far and the force hit the fragile wood. Carlos was pissed and turned his anger on me.
"No wonder you suck at math and science,"
he said. This, in addition to all the stuff going on, broke me. It is true that math and science were my worst subjects because I have a learning disability that makes those subjects tough. But I have always loved building and repairing things. My dad is an engineer and some of my earliest memories were of him teaching me how to fix my toys and encouraging me to experiment with different building things. In addition, I was a total daddy's girl. I wanted to make him proud and I knew that me being bad at math and science was something that stressed him out. So, I am not joking, I ran away like in those cliché 90s movies. My house was 2 blocks away and I ran there. Fortunately, my teachers knew that there weren't many places I could have gone and called my mom, who was a stay-at-home mom, to tell her what happened and to please return me to school. What I didn't know was that Dad was working home that day. When I ran in crying and upset, he noticed and went after me. He calmed me down and asked what happened. I told him everything about Carlos taking over, about how Janice and I were doing all the hard work and Carlos being a nasty bully, the rubber band snapping and me getting blamed. Dad was quietly hugging me, kissing my forehead. When Dad is quiet, that usually means he's angry. When I looked up, I saw that his mouth was set in a hard line and his eyes were dark. I was scared he was angry at me. I begged him to not be mad at Janice or me because it wasn't our fault. Dad instead reassured me that he wasn't mad at Janice or me, he was mad at Carlos and had an idea to teach that little punk a lesson. Dad then called the school, reassured Mrs. Adams that I was okay and that I would spend the rest of the day at home. He also sent an email to not only Mrs. Adams, but Janice's parents detailing this plan of his. Janice's parents and Mrs. Adams were a game. After we heard it, Janice and I were smiling ear to ear even though we knew we had to put in the work all by ourselves. The next day, Mrs. Adams pulled Carlos, Janice and me aside and said thanks to the glider incident, Carlos was now on his own and had to finish the project by himself. Janice and I would be doing our own project. Carlos was pretty happy about this because
"Those two slowed me down."
However, what Carlos was not thinking about was that since Janice and I were doing all the paperwork, we had all the information. We offered to share our notes with him in an attempt to be fair, but he said,
"It's all in my head, and I don't need it to slow me down. In fact, I bet I can do it even better."
We all had to sign a contract that information was not exchanged and witnessed by Mrs. Adams. The next 2 weeks were easily the best of TT for Janice and me. Since we had all of the notes, we were able to rebuild the glider in less than a week. Our dads even set up a makeshift glider range for us to test and we spent an entire Saturday flying the gliders, one in red, the other in blue, which were the most popular colors according to our surveys. As a result, we improved our glider and even made a game out of it, racing them. When Janice's dad mentioned the red and blue gliders reminded him of the Gemini dueling coaster at Cedar Point. We decided to name the toys after the coaster and make them a 2-for-1. We built the box for our gliders, got our calculations double-checked by not only Mrs. Adams but 2 independent adults as well. Both dads, who were co-workers, signed off on the math, even adding their proof of work and signing the back, this is important for later, a presentation board with an overview along with a huge binder showing all of our work. Janice and I worked really hard on this project and it felt awesome. On our last day we had a pizza party and sleepover, making bets on what Carlos' reaction was most likely going to be. Presentation day arrived. This was one of the few days we could wear something else other than our school uniform, so we were dressed in nice outfits to make our presentations. Janice and I stood together with our gliders and had big smiles on our faces. We looked at Carlos, who had an actual nice looking glider, box, presentation board, paperwork and everything. However, he had an anxious look on his face instead of his usual arrogant and cocky one, which made me happier. Presentation day worked out like this. The first half of the day would be the representatives walking around and judging who had the best looking gliders, boxes, presentation boards, binders, etc. And then we would have lunch and come back. The ones who had been selected for the second round would then make their presentations to not only the representatives but the entire class. Janice and I answered the questions asked by the representatives, arrived with confident and clear answers. One of the businesses that attended was the engineering firm that our dads worked for. They were impressed with our presentation and selected us for the second round. Carlos was also selected and he had a worrisome look on his face when the bell rang. After lunch we returned and something about the way the binder was sitting made me double check. Wouldn't you know it, the pages with double check calculations and proof of work were gone. Carlos, being the dick he was, did not keep notes about his experiments, so he decided to steal our work and present it as his own. Janice and I decided to take a professional approach in order to grind Carlos further into the dirt. I went up to Mrs. Adams and the representatives and asked them if they had gone through our binder when we were gone because the calculations and proof of work pages were missing. Mrs. Adams was immediately suspicious as well, given Carlos' behavior, and immediately walked over, took his binder off the table, flipped through it and found the corrections page. He had hastily scrawled in his name at the top next to ours, so it looked like he was involved. Mrs. Adams looked at him and said, "Carlos, why did you take the pages?" Carlos said,
They gave their work to me, remember?
Fortunately, Janice and I included our copy of the signed contract from earlier, saying Carlos had refused use of our information in our binder and pulled it out. At this point, Carlos looked like the kid who denied he had been eating cookies even though he had a ring of crumbs around his lips.
Well, they stole my double-checked work. See?
He shows the proof of work our dads had done.
I took it out and put it back.
Then Janice looked at one of the men, who I learned later was the supervisor of the team both of our dads were a part of, and said, "Mr. Lionel, could you please check his proof of work? Our dad signed the back of ours." Mr. Lionel agreed and flipped the page over. Carlos did not notice that our dads had signed the back of the proof of work and included their names. Mr. Lionel nodded. "I know those signatures anywhere," he said before looking at Carlos with a glare that could weld a flower. "You told me you wanted to be an engineer someday, right?" Carlos could only nod, his face white. "You're aware that engineers take theft of others' work seriously?" Again, Carlos nodded. "And that if you were doing this in a professional setting, you would not only be fired from the company, but blackballed from the industry?" Mr. Lionel said, staring down at this kid. Carlos looked like a melted snowman and that he wanted to disappear into the ground. I learned later that Mr. Lionel was a nice man, but man, I could immediately see why our dads respected him in that moment. Mr. Lionel turned to Mrs. Adams. "I recommend that he be disqualified from the next round and be made to apologize to these two girls in addition to returning the proofs to them." Carlos did return the paper and apologized for the theft, not looking me in the eye. As a result, not only was Carlos disqualified, but because he cheated, he flunked the project as a whole. Since TT was at least 30% of our science grade, he ended up getting his first D on his report card, which his parents had a frickin' field day with until Mr. Lionel sent them a letter telling them what their son had done and that if he did not shape up, he risked real trouble in his professional life. Janice and I ultimately won Best Design, but the best award was seeing Carlos' ego get knocked down several pegs. He was still a jerk, but was scared of us. Hey, I might be bad at math and science, but at least I know not to be mean to people who might help me someday. And ripe stars, with this we have unfortunately reached the end of today's video. However, if you cannot get enough of my stories, then I would highly suggest you to check out my endless binge watch playlist, which will show up at any moment in the left corner of the screen, which includes over 1000 ripe stories. In addition, if you would like to share one of your own stories, then please head on over to r/ripe stories on Reddit, where you can post your own story and there is a good chance that I might read it in a video. In addition, please also check out my Patreon at patreon.com/ripeyoutube for more than 50 exclusive Reddit videos that you won't find on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, your daily support is very much appreciated, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.